Hi folks, this is Jay. Hope you're okay today. It's good to see you. I've just been going through the autobiography of Charles Darwin. I just wanted to try and get in his mind why or how he moved from belief to unbelief. And I was watching the life of Charles Darwin the other day, a sort of a feature film. It kind of painting the picture of Charles Darwin being this reluctant sort of evolutionary saint who reluctantly just found the evidence of evolution really, and thereby abandoned the Christian belief. Also with his daughter dying as well, and the issue of suffering. But actually, just going through his autobiography, I've just found some information here, and it's on Darwin Online, and it's in his autobiography, part 85. And I thought this was really interesting. It says, during these 2 years, this is Darwin, I was led to think much about religion. This is when he was on the Beagle, his voyage on the Beagle. Whilst on board the Beagle, I was quite orthodox, and I remember being heartily laughed at by several of the officers. Though themselves orthodox had quoted the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality, I suppose it was the novelty of the argument that amused them. But I had gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestly false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel, and the rainbow as a sign, etc., and from its attributing to God the feeling of a revengeful tyrant, was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus, or the beliefs of any barbarian. The question then continually rose before my mind, and would not be banished: is it credible that if God were now to make a revelation to the Hindus, would he permit it to be connected with the belief in Vishnu, Shiva, as Christianity is connected with the Old Testament? This appeared to me utterly incredible. By further reflecting that the clearest evidence would be requisite to make any sane man believe in the miracles by which Christianity is supported, that the more we know of the fixed laws of nature, and the more incredible do miracles become. That men at that time were ignorant and credulous to a degree almost incomprehensible by us, that the Gospels cannot be proved to have been written simultaneously with the events, that they differ in many important details, far too important, as it seemed to me, to be admitted as the usual inaccuracies of the eyewitnesses. By such reflections as these, which I gave not as having the least novelty or value, but as they influenced me, I gradually came to disbelieve in Christianity as a divine revelation. The fact that many false religions have spread over large portions of the earth like wildfire had some weight with me. Beautiful as is the morality of the New Testament, it can hardly be denied that its perfection depends in part on the interpretation which we now put on metaphors and allegories. But I was very unwilling to give up my belief. I feel sure for this, for I can well remember often inventing daydreams of old letters between distinguished Romans and manuscripts being discovered at Pompeii or elsewhere, which confirmed in the most striking manner all that was written in the Gospels. But I found more and more difficult, with free scope given to my imagination, to invent evidence which would suffice to convince me. Thus disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress, and have never since doubted even for a single second that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true, for if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brothers, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. although I did not think much about the existence of a personal God until a considerably later period of my life. I will here give the vague conclusion to which I have been driven. The old argument of design in nature as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails. Now that the law of natural selection has been discovered, we can no longer argue that, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by a man. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course of which the wind blows. Everything in nature is the result of fixed laws. Mr. Darwin annotated this passage from "and have never since doubted" to "damnable doctrine." In her unhandwriting, Mrs. Darwin annotated this passage from "and have never since doubted" to "damnable doctrine." In her handwriting she writes, "I should dislike the passage in the brackets to be published. It seems to me raw. Nothing can be said too severe upon the doctrine of everlasting punishment for disbelief. But very few now would call that Christianity, though words are there. There is the question of verbal inspiration comes too. In 1882 this was written 6 months after her husband's death, in a second copy of the autobiography in Francis' handwriting. Then Charles Darwin goes on, "But I have discussed this subject at end of my book in the variation of domestic animals and plants, and the argument there given has never, as far as I can see, been answered. But passing over the endless beautiful adaptations which we everywhere meet with, it may be asked, how can the generally beneficent arrangement of the world be accounted for? Some writers, indeed, are so much impressed with the amount of suffering in the world that they doubt it if we look at all to all sentient beings, whether there is more misery or of happiness, whether the world as a whole is good or bad. 1. According to my judgment, happiness decidedly prevails, though this would be very difficult to prove. If the truth of this conclusion be granted, it harmonizes well with the effects which we might expect from natural selection. If all the individuals of any species were habitually to suffer to an extreme degree, they would neglect to propagate their kind. But we have no reason to believe that this has ever, or at least often, occurred. Some other considerations, moreover, lead to belief that all sentient beings have been formed so as to enjoy, as a general rule, happiness. So there we are. We've just seen the slide of Darwin's thinking from going on to the Beagle, and it was on the Beagle that his belief in God, in the Bible anyway, and God, I think God sort of slipped away because he was questioning the Old Testament, and then it was a slow progression down there. Just two points really. Jesus believed that the Old Testament was divinely inspired. He said the scriptures cannot be broken in John 10:35. He calls it the commandment of God in Matthew 15:3. He calls it the word of God in Matthew 15:6. He says, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Matthew 5 verse 18. When dealing with people of his day, he said, have you not read that which was spoken to you by God? Matthew 23:31. Have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babes hast thou prepared praise from thyself? Matthew 21:16, citing a psalm. Have you not read David, Psalm 12:3, Matthew 12, chapter 12 verse 3. Throughout the Gospels we find Jesus confirming many of the accounts of the Old Testament, such as the destruction of Sodom and the death of Lot's wife, Luke chapter 17, 26-32, the murder of Abel and his brother Cain, Luke 11:51, the calling of Moses, Mark 12:26, and the manna given in the wilderness, John 6:31-51. So anyhow, Jesus believed in the Old Testament, but here's the interesting thing. What is quite clear there, that's abundant evidence that we've had of where the slide in Charles Darwin's thinking came concerning God. It was not in relation to evolution. It was not in relation to natural selection. It was not in relation to that. It was in relation to his thinking about the Old Testament and his wrong perception of the Old Testament, and then his slide began to take place, and his prejudice and lack of understanding in some of the Christian doctrines, such as the doctrine of hell, etc. What that means is what I've always said, that morality always influences science. I really believe that human beings are moral and they are scientific, and the moral and the scientific go together. As human beings, we are moral and we are rational, and you cannot separate the two. You cannot make a dichotomy. That's what happened at the time of the Enlightenment. There was a dichotomy slowly took place between the rational and the moral. But we can't do that. We are moral and we are rational, and the moral influences the rational. Okay? And so what we're seeing is, in Charles Darwin, the moral aspect of his life began to change. He began to slowly but surely disbelieve that there was a God, down to his understanding of how he saw the Old Testament, etc. And obviously then he's open to new ideas about and new sort of new ways of looking at things, and also interpreting information, biological information, according to his new moral bias. Alright? So when he's looking at biological information, he's reading them with the glasses of an unbeliever, glasses of someone who doesn't believe in God. And not only doesn't believe in God, but has a high degree of prejudice now towards Christianity. Alright? So there we are. In other words, it's not about objective, rational, scientific investigation when it comes to evolution. He was influenced, morally speaking, as he was collecting his evidence, and that's quite clear as we see the decline of his belief in God through his understanding of the Old Testament. Thank you for listening, and God bless you. Take care, and hope everything is okay. So, I suppose my video is saying that evolution is not objective science, and I've proved it quite clearly by finding this information and seeing how Darwin's thinking changed over time away from Christianity. It was before he'd formulated his in-depth evidences for evolution. His mind had been already leaving Christianity before that, before his formulation, deep formulation, in detail formulation of evolution. And so therefore I conclude that his biological research on evolution was not objective science. It was influenced by his prejudice towards Christianity and his desire to make some kind of way forward, make sense of his own life without God. Take care, and God bless.